Good evening. Thanks for joining us for 17 News at 5. I'm Tammy Melchak.
And I'm Jim Scott. Our top story here at 5 o'clock, a funeral for a First Lady. Former First Lady Nancy Reagan laid to rest today beside her beloved husband and the nation's 40th president, Ronald Reagan. It was the denouement to an American love story that played out at the highest levels of government, both here in California and in our nation's capital. 17's Maddie Jensen live tonight at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, where she has been since early this morning. She joins us now with highlights from today's celebration of life. Good evening, Maddie.
Good evening, Jim. While it was a somber ceremony this afternoon as the country marked the loss of a former First Lady, the funeral was also filled with happy remembrances and even some laughs at stories of the petite yet tough Mrs. Reagan, who loved nothing more in this world than her husband.
Sun broke in Simi Valley this morning, marking a beautiful day to remember former First Lady Nancy Reagan. Dignitaries filed in, First Lady Michelle Obama alongside Governor Jerry Brown, former President George W. Bush and wife Laura, followed by former First Ladies Hillary Clinton and Rosalind Carter. The tent outside the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library packed with stars from the political world in Hollywood, all gathering to pay tribute to a beloved First Lady known for her fierce devotion to her husband. Mrs. Reagan's casket, piled high with peonies, her favorite flower, was escorted in shortly before the skies opened up and it began to rain.
There likely wouldn't have been a President Ronald Reagan without a Nancy Reagan.
When one finds a worthy wife, her value is far beyond pearls.
Nancy Reagan held several titles in her life, but no doubt wife was the one she treasured most. And former President Ronald Reagan made it clear he treasured her.
President Reagan and I were alone, except for the security details. When their car drove in a moment later, out stepped Nancy and Mila, looking like $1 million. And as they headed towards us, President Reagan beamed. He threw his arm around my shoulder and he said with a grin, "You know, Brian, for two Irishmen, we sure married up."
My parents were two halves of a circle, closed tight around a world in which their love for each other was the only sustenance they needed.
Mrs. Reagan's fierce love for her husband was just that, fierce.
You didn't want to get on Mom's bad side, particularly by hurting her husband.
But make no mistake, she would bop journalists, and I mean bop any journalist in this room, and we know this, if she didn't like a report you had done. But unlike so many people these days, she never seemed to harden differences into definitions.
Nancy Reagan had several unlikely friendships. One began on the campaign trail during Mr. Reagan's first run for California governor.
And that was the beginning of a remarkable friendship between the First Lady and a reporter.
Nancy was a friend, and it was lovely for my wife and I to revisit a lot of memories, but it's a day for Nancy.
And for Nancy, a day she had been waiting for since losing her husband in 2004. Reunited at last, together for eternity.
Rain poured down as mourners left the funeral this afternoon and made their way to a luncheon held in the hangar over my shoulder here, where the Air Force One used during Ronald Reagan's presidency is displayed. And while there were tears this morning and afternoon for former First Lady Nancy Reagan, mostly people said she would be happy to be reunited with her Ronnie, as she called him. Reporting live from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, I'm Maddie Jensen, 17 News.